Well, one of my worst fears, not quite my worst fear, but sort of, I got a tickle in my throat, like in a coughing fit, right before I was supposed to come up here. So I have a cough drop in my mouth. So sorry if my words sound garbled. You know what my second fear is? This one's really bad. I have a fear that I'm going to get the hiccups right before I start preaching. Like, I have had that fear for so long. It's never happened. It's not based on fact. It's just a fear. Anyway, today we are finishing up our Lenten series as we round out Lent and we look forward to Holy Week. We hope that you follow along and join us for that. It really is, like Brad said, our biggest, most exciting event of the year, the celebration of Jesus' resurrection, and we can't wait to do so with you next week. But today is actually Palm Sunday, the day that kind of kicks off Good Friday, and it is kind of the last day, like I said, of our Lenten teaching series. Specifically, throughout this particular time, we have been focusing on the 7 deadly sins, or our shadow side. So these are sloth, gluttony, lust, pride, envy, greed, and wrath. You may have heard of the 7 deadly sins before, as they're talked about in media, usually in the form of like horror films, which, yikes. And, you know, along those lines, I would say 7 deadly sins themselves, that sounds like a very severe thing. But I want to assure you, this particular group of sins was created by a 4th century monk named Evagrius of Pontus, and it was created to be a diagnostic tool, a way of being able to look at our hearts and our souls and determine the good, bad, and the ugly, to come to terms with who we really are. With the hopes, as every spiritual formation tool has the hope of doing, to become more like Jesus. And so we're not doing this series to make you feel exceedingly awful about yourself. That's definitely not the goal. The goal is simply to say, where has the shadow side taken over my heart? And the final sin or vice that we're focusing on today is that of wrath, or anger, as it's commonly known. Several years ago, this was like 2020, 2021, so there was nothing to be angry about during that time period. I was driving home from school, and I'm getting onto a highway on-ramp, and there are 2 cars just stopped, like on the on-ramp. And I like pull up and I'm like, what's happening right now? Why are the cars stopped on the on-ramp? This is very dangerous. And I see a man get out of the car in front of me, walk over to the driver's side of the car in front of him, and start screaming at whoever is driving this car. A woman proceeds, it gets worse, to get out of her car, starts screaming back at him, and before I know it, they are literally fist fighting. And I'm sitting there thinking, like, is this really happening right now? And also kind of terrified, because I'm like, is somebody gonna pull a weapon out? Like, what's gonna happen? So I pull my phone out and I'm about to dial 911 and hit call. And before I can hit call, the woman gets back into her car, slams the door, speeds off. The man runs back to his car, tons of expletives, gets in his car, like slams the door, speeds off. And I'm like, man, I better start driving before somebody gets out behind me and starts cussing me out for sitting here. I just remember thinking, like, did that really just happen? Like, I feel like I watched an episode of Cops or something. Like, I don't know what, but definitely not an experience that I felt normative or something that I had seen before. I don't remember when I did my 16-year-old driver's ed being taught, right, how to manage road rage that might occur. But unfortunately, although this example might be a little extreme, I don't think it's uncommon, and I think many of us have experienced something like this. In the first 6 months of 2024, 96% of people witnessed an act of road rage. Between 2017 and 2024, 12,610 people have been injured, and 218 people have been murdered due to road rage. 66% of traffic fatalities are caused by overly aggressive driving. 66%. 37% of road rage incidents have involved a firearm. That's terrifying. And in the last 10 years alone, there has been a 500% increase in reported cases of road rage. And although some people might say that driving aggressively has increased because people's driving ability has decreased, I can't accept that premise. For a driver's skill level should never induce this kind of anger and violence. And so the question remains, what is going on? Apparently, it's not just road rage that's on the rise, it's anger. According to Gallup's Global Emotions Report, anger around the world has risen since 2016, with 23% of respondents now feeling angry on any given day. The customer service industry has reported a sharp uptick in customer abuse in recent years. The healthcare industry has shown a rise in patient-to-provider violence. And of course, we have to look no further than Facebook, X, Nextdoor to see all the ways in which anger and rage seem to have invaded people's hearts and lives. And I have not even touched the overtly political outrage that has happened since 2016. Maybe this is why author Ed Stetzer describes our current moment as the age of outrage. We are living in a day, indeed a moment of shouting, anger, rage, and hatred. And I think we all must consider how this outrage has infected our souls. Do you feel like screaming or throwing something at a wall when you read a headline or a social media post? Do you find yourself regularly ranting about what some public figure did? Do you frequently rage about coworkers or family members who have slighted you? Are you angry more often than not? Outrage has infected us all, if we were all being honest. And the question that we have to ask ourselves as Jesus followers is, how do we resist the vice or sin of anger and live as Jesus would have? So if you would turn with me to Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 26. It'll give me a chance to drink a sip of this tea and tell you a little bit about this passage. Ooh, allergies or something. Matthew chapter 5 through chapter 7 records Jesus' longest sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, in which Jesus describes life in the kingdom or his new world order. Specifically in chapter 5, we see Jesus primarily concerned with our actions. He focuses on laws in the Old Testament, expands or deepens them, suggesting that we must also tend to the state of our soul. And he does this in our passage today. Picking up in verse 21, Jesus says this: "You have heard it said of those of old, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment.'" So that phrase, "those of old," is specifically referring to the Israelites who would have heard Moses give the 10 Commandments. Jesus here is explicitly quoting Exodus chapter 20, verse 13, where Moses says, "You shall not murder." So in the first half of verse 22, we see Jesus quote a command from the Old Testament, and then he goes on to say, verse 24, verse 22 again, "But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment." So Jesus, the most qualified interpreter of the scriptures, says, "But," and then extends the commandment of do not murder to do not be angry. Notice he's not relaxing or replacing the law here. He isn't saying it's okay to murder, but don't get angry. Rather, he is showing us that the law goes much further than we thought. He deepens it. In Jesus' kingdom, anger is just as bad as murder. For as we learned in my introduction today, isn't anger often the thing that leads to murder? I want to take a moment and stop and kind of define what anger we're talking about here, because some of you just became afraid for the state of your soul because you yelled at your dog and he peed on your carpet this morning. So I just want to take a second and say, okay, what type of anger are we talking about here? Rebecca DeYoung, an author of a great book, actually, on the 7 deadly sins, she calls it glittering vices. If you've been interested in this series and want to read more, it's a good one. She says this about anger. She says, anger is a healthy emotion and a hellish habit. A healthy emotion and a hellish habit. And I want to spend some time on both of these adjectives. So first, anger as a healthy emotion. Throughout the scriptures, we see God referred to as angry, and thus we know that anger can actually be a good characteristic. I'm going to break this down. So in the Old Testament specifically, a majority of passages that mention God's wrath or anger are found in the Pentateuch or the prophets. And if you were to examine all of these passages, a few themes would emerge. Number one, the reason for God's anger or wrath is either idolatry or a lack of mercy towards the poor and needy. When the people of God are either idolatrous or unfaithful to him, or when they oppress the powerless, turn a blind eye to those in need. This is why Jesus summarizes all of the law and prophets by saying this: love God above all and your neighbor as yourself. Thomas Aquinas actually calls this phrase the demands of basic justice. Oh, I love that. The demands of basic justice. And when these demands of justice are violated, God gets angry. Additionally, if you were to read all the passages about God's anger, a single verse would begin emerging over and over again, almost verbatim, and it is this: the Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. God's anger or wrath is always described as slow and rooted in love. And this is a very different kind of anger than we have come to learn, experience, or expect. Old Testament passages aside, the one place in the New Testament where people often talk about the theme of anger, we see this happening when Jesus flips tables, right? So this actually ties into Palm Sunday really well. Jesus enters, right, Jerusalem, the triumphal entry. He gets to the temple. He sees that there are being charges, basically for sacrifices, trumped up charges, and he begins flipping tables. And so many people look at this verse and they say, well, Jesus got angry, violently angry, and that makes my anger okay. And I want to take just a second to have a better understanding of this passage, because as you will see, Jesus' anger here is the same type of anger that we see from God in the Old Testament. So number one, when it comes to the story, Jesus doesn't kill the money changers, okay? He does not hit them. He does not abuse them. In all three Gospels, it says he drives them out. Second, Jesus' anger here is solely for Jewish leaders and elite who should have known better. Those with privilege who had abused their privilege for their own gain, not in the love of service of others, violating God's command, they had chosen to abuse their privilege. Third, Jesus also, this was like not the first time Jesus had gone to the temple, okay? So Jesus doesn't stumble on this scene and it's like, how dare they do that, right? No, he has gone to the temple over and over again and likely has become increasingly annoyed at what's happening. This is probably not the first time he has been a little angry about what's going on. So to be clear, this scene here is not an outburst or a fit of rage. It is a calculated, righteous, and pointed action, one that he has taken time to think about. And number 4, it's also theorized that Jesus' anger here comes from temple segregation, the exclusion of certain people, namely women, Gentiles, foreigners, children, and the lame and blind, the powerless. And so once again, anger is demonstrated through Jesus as a good characteristic of God in response to the oppression, exclusion of the powerless. Therefore, we should get angry about the things that makes God angry. That's a good thing. Pastor Jeff Cook puts it this way: there is great pain in our world, and our anger alerts us to the fact that it needs fixing. We become angry when we see the weak exploited, those we care about injured, what we value destroyed. The desire for justice is legitimate. In fact, God desires the elimination of evil even more than we do. So anger can be a healthy emotion, but I think we would all agree that it can also be a hellish habit. Specifically, anger becomes a hellish habit when we get angry too easily. This is when we are quick-tempered, irritable, have frequent mood swings, are rude, bicker all the time, use cutting remarks, or frequent profanity. Anger can become a hellish habit when we get angrier than we should, when our response is disproportionate to the offense, when things quickly snowball. This is the typical blow-up scene or the angry typing on a keyboard to a social media post, right? Yelling over some small incident. Anger becomes a hellish habit when we take out our anger on the wrong person. The recipient of your anger is just the closest or the most available person nearby. When you have a bad day at work and you scream at the person that you're picking your food up from through the drive-thru, or you take your frustration out on your spouse, your kids, or your roommate. Anger becomes a hellish habit when we stay angry too long. When we hold resentment or a grudge. When we refuse to forgive or reconcile. When we fantasize about vengeance or passive-aggressive tactics. Author Henry Farley defines the vice or sin of anger this way, saying, "The love of justice perverted into the desire for revenge and the injury of someone else." The love of justice perverted into the desire for revenge and for the injury of someone else. And this is the kind of anger that Jesus is referencing in this passage, the shadow side of anger. Jesus here is not referring to petty or trivial disagreements. He's not referring to large social injustices. He's also not saying the emotion of anger is in and of itself always wrong or inherently evil. But rather, Jesus is confronting our decision to be angry people or to harbor anger towards another person, an image bearer of God. The word anger in verse 22 refers to fits of madness, remaining angry, nursing a grudge, resentment, harboring contempt towards a human being or an image bearer of Christ. Or as scholar Dale Bruner puts it, the anger of a man or woman who nurses their wrath to keep it warm. And Jesus takes this kind of anger very seriously. Picking back up in verse 22. We'll eventually get through it. Apparently, I want to move on because I keep wanting to say 24. Picking back up in verse 22. Jesus says, whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says you fool will be liable to the hell of fire. Now, we read this verse. We reflexively want to pull back from this kind of language, right? Because it is intense. And honestly, for good reason. Many of the times, vocabulary like this or scripture has been a favorite in manipulative religious movements. And although that is not a good thing, I also do just maybe want to take a moment to talk about how this could be a positive thing, what we read here. Now, I wish I had time to unpack all that Jesus might mean by the hell of fire. Many kind of say that he's talking about like a hell of your own making. Like if you can think of a really, really angry person, or even someone who does commit murder, right? They live in a hell of their own making. But regardless of exactly what he's trying to get across, here is what we can pull from this particular passage. God takes evil very seriously. And that is good news for us, even if it confronts the evil in our heart. And here's why. What parent doesn't confront a school principal about a bully terrorizing their child? To love a child is to judge the unrepentant bully. Dale Bruner, again, puts it this way. God's love would not be love if it did not work to remove all that ungraciously hurts. And although there can be a lot of shame or condemnation or guilt from hearing a scripture passage like this, my hope is that it doesn't just motivate us to sadness or wallowing, but it motivates us to action. To say, I want to change my action, the way in which my anger manifests itself in the world. And the good news is Jesus gives us some ways to do this. He goes on to say in verse 23 through 24, so if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. So this provides, we need a little translation here because this example essentially that he's using here would have made sense contextually to those listening to Jesus' sermon, but doesn't necessarily contextually make sense for us. So a little bit of background. The religious gathering of Jesus' day was either the synagogue or the temple. And although there were local synagogues in each town, there was only one temple or one place that the Jewish people could go and offer sacrifice to God as a part of their worship. This act of sacrifice is what we understand or know today as confessing or admitting where we have fallen short. It's like our practice of confession. And Jesus is giving this sermon in a place called Galilee, which is approximately 80 miles from Jerusalem where the temple would have been. This is like the distance between Kansas City, Missouri and Clinton, Missouri. So like an hour and a half drive going 70 miles an hour. And it was not uncommon for Jewish people to travel this very long distance, at least once a year, if not more than that, on foot to the temple to make a sacrifice. And so when Jesus tells his disciples to go back immediately and reconcile, he's not simply saying walk back to your home a few blocks away or hop in your SUV and take your 30-minute commute back home. He's saying it would be better for you to make a 200-plus mile journey on foot to the temple, back to Galilee, back to the temple to give your sacrifice than to give your sacrifice unreconciled to your brother. That's intense. So Jesus doesn't just take anger seriously, he takes reconciliation very seriously. For the act of sacrifice or worship is not nearly as important as the spirit in which it's done in. Verses 23 through 24 also show us that although Jesus views anger or wrath as wrong, he knows anger will happen, right? Or else why would he give us a way to deal with it? And so Jesus' command, again, shouldn't necessarily be about keeping anger from happening, but rather what we do immediately when it does. We must understand that in this life, we will consistently break God's commands. He knows that. But it is just as important that we understand we can keep God's commands by immediately reconciling. And finally, Jesus takes reconciliation one step further when he says in verse 25, "Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly, I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny." Here we see Jesus move from an example of anger between, or like resentment between a Christian and a Christian, so like a brother and a brother, to a Christian and an outsider. And in doing so, Jesus says it's not enough to demonstrate reconciliation in the church, or maybe a better way of saying this, it's not enough to demonstrate reconciliation with those you love. You must reconcile with all people, even and especially with your opponent or your worst enemy. Somebody you would take to court. And comically, he suggests that on the way to court, you should reconcile. That you should figure it out before you even have to get there. This would be like somebody figuring out how to reconcile with someone they're suing before they make it to Judge Judy, and then they get to Judge Judy, and they're like, "Oh, we already figured it out. Thanks." Right? That's what Jesus is saying to do here. This is how important reconciliation is to Jesus. Don't wait till you get to court. Work out your disputes, your anger, before you get to the judge, he says. Reconcile even if it interrupts your worship to God or a legal judgment. Two really important things. Deal with your anger swiftly. Worship team, if you would join me. Many of you know I became what I like to call an instant mom. I think that's fun. To a 9-month-old in July of last year. She's now a very independent, very opinionated, very strong-willed, goofy, adorable, and outgoing 18-month-old with a whole lot of burgeoning emotions. There's just so many of them. And in February of this year, she began having what I would call her first toddler meltdown. I think that's the most gracious way to say it. Screaming, crying, kicking, hitting, you name it. All very developmentally normal things, but frustrating nonetheless. Like, she may have been prepared for all these emotions, but I certainly was not. And so very quickly, I realized I was becoming angry and angrier and angrier, that I was raising my voice way more than I would care to admit, that my fuse had gotten really, really short. And after responding angrily several times and realizing that it was only making the problem worse, I was like, okay, I got to figure something else out. It's not working. And so I consulted friends, family members. I did some reading, some different books on psychology of anger and on emerging toddlers. And it shouldn't have been a surprise to me, but shockingly, what I found was Jesus' teachings on anger and reconciliation wrapped up in just a new language. It was like ancient wisdom in new clothes, or words that were easier for me to understand. To this day, I am not perfect by any stretch of imagination. In fact, I'm sure those that do microchurch with me on a regular basis know this and could tell you this. Definitely not perfect. But I do think that some of the things that I've learned have been helpful. And they're things that I think we can all apply as we look to take Jesus' teachings and fight the shadow of anger that so quickly descends on our hearts and our minds. So 3 steps. We'll go over each of these. First one is this. Notice your anger. Notice your anger. Anger is an emotion that happens. Jesus knew it would happen. It happens to all of us. Thus, anger itself is not wrong, but we do need to learn self-awareness, to recognize when we are angry or when we are getting angry. We need to do it before we act best we can, before we react impulsively. This is noticing when our heart starts beating a little faster, when our voice starts rising in either pitch or volume, when you realize you want to interrupt, undercut, or do something impulsively. We need to notice our anger, stop, acknowledge the emotion, whether it's taking a few deep breaths, whether it's taking a break, whatever that looks like, we need to notice our anger. And then 2, we need to practice compassion and curiosity. Let me unpack this. The goal, again, is not necessarily to eliminate anger, but the goal should be to better understand it and then better respond. And the only way we better respond is to work to understand ourselves and the person or object to which we are angry with. It's to work to identify what is causing that anger and then all of those unhelpful thoughts, right, that begin circling through our mind. As we identify, as we capture those, we work to reframe them. So I'm going to give you an example of this because this is definitely the hardest step to kind of wrap your brain around. On Wednesday, people in my Midtownkc.church know this, right before everybody was coming over, my daughter wanted to go outside. And I'm like, no, baby, we can't go outside. People are about to come over. And I kid you not, she looks at me, furrow brow, stomps over, and then just whacks me in the leg. And I look down, and I'm like, did you just hit me? She looks up at me, like, yeah, of course I did, Mom. You didn't do what I wanted. And in the moment, right, I'm angry, I'm frustrated, and several different unhelpful thoughts or beliefs begin to surface to my mind. Let's see if any of these sound familiar to you. I need to fix this right now, or she will not learn. Or so-and-so won't learn, right? Am I an awful parent? Am I an awful coworker? Am I an awful family member? When did this person learn that this was acceptable behavior? Or I need to assert my authority. She needs to know who's boss, right? But instead of listening to these thoughts or these beliefs or reacting from these thoughts, I recognize them as unhelpful and untruthful, and I work to reframe them. My daughter has very little control as an 18-month-old, and she's trying to exercise what very little control she has. My daughter has not learned how to poop on the potty, let alone how to appropriately express her anger, right? She's not 16, even though she thinks she is. She's 18 months old. My daughter is testing her boundaries. She wants to know, will I still love her even if she hits me? Wow, those are way helpful thoughts, way more helpful, right? And when I work to reframe, when I work to practice compassion and curiosity for both myself and for her, I practice what Jesus calls loving my neighbor as myself. I don't vilify myself or her, right? I seek to be kind and understand. Last one, number 3, we work to change our response. Instead of raising my voice or grabbing her hand, right, we take what I like to call a break together. I make sure I'm looking her in the eye. I usually put a hand on her chest or her back, and we count to 10, sometimes more than that, because it takes a while. We get to a place where both of us are calm. I explain once again that she can't go outside. I explain that hitting is not kind. And then, this is the key, we make amends. She reconciles with me. And the way an 18-month-old does this is by signing sorry or blowing me a kiss, okay? So we're pretty simple here. But nonetheless, right, she's learning how to reconcile. Sometimes it takes a few tries, it doesn't always work first, or sometimes I have to count to 50. But it does feel so much better than the cycle of anger that we consistently were both participating in. So next time you're on social media and you're angered by a post, stop. Notice your anger. Practice compassion and curiosity. Identify unhelpful thoughts or beliefs like so-and-so is an awful person, or how could they say that, or I will show them. Have compassion and curiosity for yourself and them. Put yourself in their shoes. Be curious and reframe. Change your response. Instead of reactively, impulsively, and furiously commenting, take a day to think about it. It's amazing what a day does. Determine whether you want to respond online at all, or if maybe an in-person encounter would be better. Next time a coworker says something hurtful or fires off a passive-aggressive email, we all know those, notice your anger. Practice compassion and curiosity. Identify unhelpful thoughts like, they don't like me. They don't deserve this job. I wish they were fired. Exercise compassion and curiosity towards yourself and them. And change your response. Think about it for a day or two. Decide how you want to address it. You don't have to respond immediately. In fact, they may take it better if you wait. This is a crazy idea. Pray about it. Ask God, do you have any insight into this person? Is there a way that you are wanting me to love them? How can I be kind in my challenge or my frustration with them? And the same goes for your microchurch, your family, your friends. You fill in the blank. Reconcile with all people, not just those you love. And when we do inevitably mess up, because we will, we seek reconciliation. The amends making that I'm trying to teach my daughter. We ask ourselves who we've wronged, and then we go to that person and we ask for forgiveness. We think of someone we've been harboring anger or resentment towards. We go to that person, we say, I'm sorry. We make direct amends, except for when doing so would injure or harm another. Jesus instructs us, pursue reconciliation and do so immediately, as quick as you can. For I think this is the only way that we can keep the vice or the sin of anger at bay. We consistently quiet our souls, where we fall on our own sword, so to speak. We practice soft-heartedness, and we come before God and others. We say, I'm so sorry. Will you forgive me? This is how we prevent the shadow of anger from taking over our souls, from the age of outrage penetrating our hearts. Let's pray.